Hey, everybody, welcome back to the podcast. You're listening to the longest running superhero role playing game on Earth, also known as the Continuum Chronicles. As always, I'm your host, Chris Kent, the Game Master. And in this one, I'm going to not do the normal format I normally do. Um, I'm basically just going to defend myself for why we have a episode that my players affectionately refer to as Mary Poppins versus Cthulhu. It sounds all sorts of stupid. I'm keenly aware of this fact. Um, let's dive in and I'll explain how this came to pass. So, uh, for Halloween of 2012, uh, I was going to have a Halloween party, and as is often, if not always, the case in my house, that means gaming. Lots of times we'll run something like Dungeons and Dragons, and we'll do like a Ravenloft game or something like that, like a Dracula's Castle kind of a deal. At any rate, that year, because everybody had been talking about the end of the world with 2012, and that was coming in December or whatever. A lot of the games I was running that year were kind of apocalyptic in nature, right? And and so I decided to run a Cthulhu game. And so it was set in 1925. It was set in my existing game world, the superhero game world. And 1925 is a tricky time period because Superman's first appearance, for instance, is 1938. Most of the comic book stuff happens after that. Before 1938, you get like the Shadow. His first appearance was actually 1930. You get some other characters, the pulp age, like people call it, would be characters like, for instance, Flash Gordon, um, Doc Samson, characters like that, right? And so, at any rate, I started to get this idea of kind of like a pulp kind of a game that would basically be Cthulhu versus the League of Extraordinary Gentlemen. I thought that'd be pretty cool. And again, I imagined the heroes as all being very low level, kind of human level, street level guys. And the first person to RSVP my Halloween party was a friend of mine named James. And he, at the time, worked at the Columbus Zoo in the gorilla enclosure. And he would like feed the gorillas, give them medicine, stuff like that. So when he writes back, he says, "Can I be Tarzan?" Um, and I was like, "Yeah, that's fine. That's cool with me." And it seemed very up his alley. Um, and it didn't seem to me like it would clash with my game world because we'd already had adventures with like Shauna the She-Devil and Kazar of the Savage Land and stuff like that, right? So I said, "Yeah, sure, of course, you can be Tarzan." Um, and then my son comes to me, and he would have just been a wee little guy at the time, maybe, well, let me think. He'd be like 7 years old, I guess. And he would watch the movie The Shadow with me, with Alec Baldwin, the 1994 film. And I always, by the way, loved the Golden Age stuff. I loved The Shadow. The Rocketeer was my favorite, stuff like that. And so at any rate, and someone did mention the Rocketeer for this game, and I was like, well, he gets the rocket pack in 1938, so like you can't really do it before that. You know what I mean? So like, no, I can't do a 1925 Rocketeer story. So I didn't give that one the green light. But my son comes to me wanting to be the Shadow. So I do a little research, and the Shadow's first appearance is 1930. I go, it can be a little early. And so I listened to the old radio show, which I love. And interestingly enough, in the Shadow's like first thing or whatever, I didn't get the impression that it was like his first day on the job. In fact, I thought it was the contrary, that when people are scared of the Shadow and stuff like that, I was sort of thinking, um, he had already developed like a reputation where people had heard of him and stuff like that. So the more I kind of got into it, and even the 1994 movie, they mentioned the fact that Lamont Cranston went missing in World War One, and he's in Asia, and he's like learning, all this psychic stuff to become the Shadow. I'm like, I could kind of see that actually. Um, that the more I thought about it, the less it bothered me that he could have been active in 1925. So I approved it. And the other thing is, it's not just about that one game session, right? It's about your son is showing interest in your hobby and you want to cultivate that interest and you want to encourage it. Is something you want to share with them, and you want like family game night and stuff, which by the way, we have that now, right? And so part of that, it's important that when someone's pitching you something for the first time like that, you try to encourage them rather than like be a wet blanket. So I'm like, yeah, sure, great idea, be the Shadow. And he asks if he can have the cool knife from the movie. And there's a thing, I think it's called like the Purba, and it's like a psychic knife dagger thing that like can fly around and stuff. And I was like, yeah, that's fine. In the grand scheme of things, I don't think that's a make or break thing here. Um, so yeah, sure. And I'm used to like Dungeons and Dragons where it's very common to have a magic item or a special weapon or something on your character sheet. So yeah, it didn't seem like a big deal at all. Um, and then my wife couldn't think of anybody to play, so I'm going to come back to her. My wife's friend Kayla was coming to the party, and so she picked Indiana Jones. And unlike, say, Tarzan, who I was not really familiar with at all, other than just the most basic thing of like he wears a loincloth and swings from vines and stuff like that, right? Turns out actually in the Tarzan novels, he has really wacky out there adventures where like he goes to Mars and fights aliens and all sorts of stuff I had not known at the time. But at any rate, Indiana Jones, on the other hand, I'd seen the original three movies, which in my opinion is kind of all you really need to see when it comes to Indiana Jones. Um, at any rate, I also watched the Young Indiana Jones Chronicles back in the day when that was on TV. So I knew he was adventuring at younger ages and stuff, and I looked up his age and all that, and I was like, yeah, Indiana Jones is fine. Not only is he fine, I think he's a really good fit for the idea of this lost world kind of coming up from under the sea, and the whole thing where he's into like lost civilizations and artifacts and stuff, and the whole place would have obelisks covered in weird runes, and all that is then covered in like this wet seaweed and sea slime and stuff. And I was like, yeah, I can totally see Indiana Jones in that situation, right? Yes, he's great. He's perfect. So then Kayla's husband, Nick, who's like 20 at the time or something, and I was like 40-ish or something. Nick is like, can I be Popeye? And he never played a role-playing game like ever. So all the stuff I said about my son, this kind of applies here too, where you don't want to be mean. I mean, universally speaking, you should never be mean, period. But you don't want to like turn him off to gaming, right? But at the same time, he says Popeye. And I think to myself, like, I used to watch Popeye cartoons as a kid. It wasn't really my thing, like I didn't hate it, but I could kind of take it or leave it. All I could really remember was that he was strong, like when he ate spinach. So I said to Nick, well, let me research Popeye first and see if it's a good fit. And he was like, cool. So I watched a Popeye cartoon like on YouTube or something. And in this cartoon, like I forget what it was, some kind of a bull or something like charges Popeye. So he punches it, like he eats the spinach first, gets strong, and then he punches this thing and it hits the sun And so when I watch cartoons, I think like a game master, right? And so the first thing I notice is it takes like 2 seconds for the bull to reach the sun. Arguably 1 second if you assume, well, that doesn't really work. I was going to say because the light has to reach Popeye's eye too, but at the end of the day, the thing doesn't work, right? It's not very physics friendly. But so I'm thinking, well, God, how strong does Popeye have to be? Like, how many APs of strength do you give Popeye to be able to punch something so hard it breaks the light barrier, right? Um, I was like, holy crap. Because that's not what I wanted for the game, right? I wanted a street level party of very human level guys, not I will punch you into the sun so hard you move faster than light. And then the other thing I didn't like about it was when this thing hits the sun, it gives the sun a black eye, and, and the sun has a face. It doesn't like that it got hit, right? Um, I didn't want that. I didn't want any part of that in my game world. So I get back to Nick and I say, yeah, it's not going to work out. Sorry, pick a different thing. And, like I say, I'm like twice his age. So for my age group, that's not a big deal whatsoever, right? When I was a kid, if you were bad, uh, li- literally, I'm not joking, my grandpa would look for a piece of metal laying around the farm, and that's what he would use on my butt. Like we didn't have a wooden paddle or whatever. He would use like tractor parts. And it was not uncommon. Like if you did something bad, like if you threw the frisbee in grandma's flower bed and when you went to go get it, you stepped on her flowers that she cares about, maybe you get sent to bed without food that day, you know, just all sorts of stuff. And so telling me I can't play the character that I came up with like doesn't even register on my radar as as a bad thing, right? Like I've had way worse. So I'm like, that's fine, who cares? I'll pick a different character. Um Nick, and I'm not trying to insult Nick. If Nick's listening, shout out to Nick, shout out to Kayla if she's listening. But that's not his generation, right? That's not what he's used to, I don't think. And so I remember him looking at me and he looked like he was going to cry. Like his eyes were real like big and like looked like wet. And he's like, well, but I really like Popeye. And I remember thinking to myself, I don't know, people in hell like ice water. Sucks to be them. Pick a different character. Um, but I was like, well, okay, like, maybe I'll meet you halfway and we say, what if Popeye was just a human being and for some reason people were telling these tall tales about him that he could do all this crazy stuff, and then you could still play the personality, um, but without all the like mind bending, reality warping superpowers. And he was just like, no, I want to be Popeye. And like he just wouldn't let go of it. And I watched the Robin Williams movie. That was more toned down at least. And I asked him what he thought of that, and he did like the Robin Williams movie. Which even in that movie he's doing cartoony stuff, which by the way, they accomplished using practical effects. So shout out to those guys. But it seemed a little more manageable and I was like, okay, like let me see what I can do. I'll make the character sheet, I'll let you be Popeye. And Nick was like, "Cool, I'll watch some cartoons to like jog my memory." And I was like, "No, no, 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 don't. Don't do that." Because I didn't want him to come to the table with expectations, right? I hate it when a player has baggage that I have to deal with. And the more of a blank slate the player can be, just the easier it is for me on my end. So I said, "You know what? Don't." I was like, "What's the reason you want to be Popeye right now?" And he was like, "Because he's strong." And I was like, "Great, let's just focus on that." So I made a character sheet for Popeye and I gave him some crazy amount of super strength. I don't know if it was like Superman level strength or Hulk level strength. I can't remember now what I gave him. It's been too long. But I gave him a bunch of strength and a bunch of body so that he could take a beating too. And then I think I gave him Omni power and just a little bit of it. And that kind of represented all the weird stuff Popeye was doing. And in my mind, I'm like, maybe Popeye is kind of like, maybe he's kind of like a mutant, kind of X-Men style mutant. And maybe his abilities are kind of like the stuff Plastic Man does. I was trying to kind of justify it. And then something else I do a lot actually is if I'm trying to put something into the game and I don't feel good about the tone, the thing I always fall back on is, what if Tim Burton did this? What would Tim Burton's Popeye look like? So that's kind of how I did it. And which, by the way, works really well in a Cthulhu game because then Cthulhu is putting off this kind of aura of creepiness and everything is horrific, and you know what I mean? So I was like, yeah, we can still make this work. And then I used Dagda, of course. He's the connective tissue that ties all these stories together that take place in all these different time periods. Um, so he's in the party, and so the last person that has to pick is my wife. And and so she's not finding anybody she likes in 1925. And so finally she comes up with Mary Poppins. And so she wants to play Mary Poppins. And by the way, she didn't just grow up on like Beauty and the Beast and Little Mermaid and crap like that. She also grew up on like Mary Poppins and Chitty Chitty Bang Bang and the whatever, the 60s live action Disney stuff, Apple Dumpling Gang and stuff like that, right? That was never my thing. I was never a Disney guy. So I was completely unfamiliar with Mary Poppins. And I was like, isn't she like a maid or something? And she's like, yeah. And so at first I'm thinking like, oh, she's kind of like a female version of Alfred from Batman. And like, well, that should be fine in like a League of Extraordinary Gentlemen type situation. And I was like, maybe, you know, like I'm not going to give it the red light and say you can't do it. I'm not going to give you the green light and say you can. I'll give you the yellow light and say, let me get back to you. Let me think on it. And so I start to research Mary Poppins and it blew my mind. I can't remember who it was. It was some comic book guy. It's like famous 80s comic guy, like Neil Gaiman who did Sandman, or like Alan Moore who did Watchmen. It was somebody like that. And they did a comic book where you find out that Mary Poppins' secret identity is she is God, like as in the God, right? Um, and I'm a Christian, so like that makes me uncomfortable, right? Like I'm like, I don't know how I feel about that. And so I'm reading why the person basically has arrived at this conclusion, and they're talking about, first of all the stuff that Mary Poppins can do. It seems that she is omnipotent. And I thought that was interesting. I was like, okay. And so she can make brooms clean the house on their own. She can turn people into cartoons and back again. She can just do whatever she wants. She seems to have absolute control over reality. And I was like, oh, guess I missed that part. And then the other thing is she's cleaning these kids. And of course she's like a maid or a nanny or whatever her deal is supposed to be. So she's like cleaning these kids, she's like looking after. And then he brings up all the times in the Bible when like they use the word unclean to refer to something bad, basically. And and I was like, wow, okay. Um, I'm starting to see the dots connected. And I was like, man, I really do not want to say in my game world that Mary Poppins is God. Like that's uncomfortable. And then I kept doing more research, and I was shocked at how many people basically had arrived at that same conclusion. And even if they weren't saying she actually is God, right? They were saying basically that was her power set, that she was still, even if you don't think she's God, she still seems to be like omnipotent. Um, and I was like, wow, okay. And I remember conversations at the time, like, maybe she's a member of the Q continuum or something like that. And, at the end of the day, I think I said, well, let's just not address it. Like, because at no point does she tell anybody what she is. She just says, I'm Mary Poppins, right? So I'm like, let's play it that way. Um, and just because sometimes, like for instance, I will tell my players sometimes, like, you have the freedom to do this thing if you want to do this thing, but I'm just going to put all my cards on the table and say, if you do this thing, it's going to ruin the game session I have planned. Now, that said, if you want to do the thing, I won't stop you. But if you want to do what I have planned, giving you a heads up. Or sometimes I'll say, you can do the thing, and if you do the thing, our game session is over and everybody came here to have a good time, and maybe they won't. And my player group is really good actually about going, oh, I don't want to ruin everybody's good time. I just won't do the thing. You know what I mean? So at any rate, I was kind of saying that to my wife about playing Mary Poppins, where I'm like, well, this is a huge problem, honey. She's like, I got it. Like I got it under control. I won't overstep my bounds or whatever. And I was like, okay. Um, and so then the other thing I'm doing uh is I'm looking at, I'm like, okay, so I need stats for Cthulhu. And I knew there'd been at least one Cthulhu role-playing game. And I'm like, well, let's see what his stats look like. So I start researching that. And it turns out there's been lots of Cthulhu role-playing games. I believe Chaosium did a Call of Cthulhu game back in the 80s. And so I got those stats and I was looking at those. And then there was a D20 Cthulhu, and I can't remember now, because again, it's been so long. I can't remember if it was like like an official Cthulhu game or like a fan made thing or what. And then I owned GURPS Cthulhu, and none of them gave him the same stats at all. Uh, I was talking to people online and forums and stuff who were big Lovecraft fans. I had a friend at the time named Chris Crows who had read literally everything like Lovecraft had ever done. And he had like a photographic memory and stuff. And I was asking him questions about it. And like just nothing was like adding up, right? I was not getting a consistent idea about what Cthulhu was so that I could correctly run it in the game. And all the while I'm doing all this research and so on and so forth, it's getting closer and closer to Halloween. And I'm like, well, this is a problem. Like this whole thing is just coming apart. My original plan of Cthulhu versus the League of Extraordinary Gentlemen, like that is just not what we're doing now. It's completely careened out into left field. And so the big night comes, and the first two that show up are Kayla and Nick, and they are literally dressed as Indiana Jones and Popeye for this Halloween party. And I was like, oh crap, like people are really looking forward to this. This is how they're going to spend their Halloween, playing this game. And man, this game is not going to go well. Like I can tell right now. And so they showed up, and I was like, oh, like I felt bad. And my wife owns various like steampunk dresses and stuff, so she put on one of her steampunk dresses, so she was like cosplaying as Mary Poppins. James shows up, and I think he had a little stuffed animal monkey thing or whatever that was supposed to be like Tarzan's pet. I think its name is Cheetah. It's a monkey named Cheetah, right? I can't remember now to be sure, but whatever. You get the idea. Everybody shows up. Everybody's excited. I think my son had some little trench coat he liked playing around in when he was a kid, and he was wearing like a trench coat and a cowboy hat. That was supposed to be his shadow outfit, for the game. And he brought a butter knife in from the kitchen. That was supposed to be the thing the shadow had. And so we play. And we start off, and I said I gave Popeye a boat. I thought that was appropriate. kind of like a little tugboat kind of a thing. They get to where this island has risen up out of the sea. And I'm saying there's this like horrible rain the whole time, lightning in the distance, so on and so forth. And the entire island is covered in this like slimy crap. And I described like where I live now, for instance, I live across from the pond. And if you walk into that pond, the entire bottom of the pond is like pond scum, right? So I was describing similar stuff. I'm like, you gotta, if you want to look at the runes on these stone structures, you gotta like scrape this like scummy crap off of it. And when they got onto the island, I'm like, everybody, roll dice and give me a dexterity check to see if you can keep your footing on this slippery crap. And I think Indiana Jones failed his roll. And so just from round one, he like cracks his head on like one of these stone obelisks or whatever. And his head is like bleeding and he took a couple points of damage. And I'm trying to set up a tone, like I'm trying to establish a serious tone, despite the fact that Popeye and Mary Poppins are in the party, right? I'm trying my hardest to establish a serious tone. And it's going so. And I kind of told everybody too, by the way. I was like, don't necessarily think this is like the Disney Mary Poppins. Think of it more as this is like a literary Mary Poppins. This is an alternate Mary Poppins. And yeah, and so she, by the way, because everything's dirty and unclean, so she's like sort of just floating in the air with her umbrella, and then the rain is the umbrella is like keeping her a little more tidy with all of this like torrential, horrible rain and all this stuff going on. And at any rate, so Cthulhu wakes up, and that was something people didn't like. Especially because I had a website back then and I put the adventure on the website at the time, and man, did this one get hate mail. I had no idea people would care that much about Cthulhu, but they did. And one of them was Nick, who's the guy playing Popeye. He was a big Cthulhu fan, and he did not like that Cthulhu woke up. By the way, since I ran that game, I have encountered Cthulhu in so many different like cartoons and so on and so forth. And whether it's the Venture Brothers or the Justice League or whatever, Cthulhu keeps showing up in these different media, right? And he's never the same. Like, there's a lot of wiggle room, I think, for anybody wanting to tell a Cthulhu story. I've even seen stuff at the gaming shop near me that is like Cthulhu in space, right? I've seen Cthulhu where the idea is Cthulhu is a race and not a single being. Like the Cthulhu stuff is like all over the place. So I was a little taken aback that people were so offended by what I was doing. And what I literally did was I took all the stats, I converted all the stats I could find on Cthulhu from every different role playing game I could find, and I cherry picked from all of them. So I gave him the best dexterity I could find. I gave him the best strength I could find. I gave him the most hit points out of any of the versions, right? So this was like the best Cthulhu I could come up with. And at any rate, so what happens is essentially we split the party. So the three toughest characters go to where Cthulhu is. And so that's Dagda, Mary Poppins, and Popeye, right? They go there. Meanwhile, Indiana Jones, the Shadow, and Tarzan have to deal with that knife that the Shadow brought with him, the Purba, because the whole deal with that thing is it it like how do I want to word this? Whoever is the most psychic controls the thing. So it will act on that character's behalf. And so in this scenario, that character is Cthulhu. So the Shadow loses total control over the thing. And it starts attacking the street level characters. So we basically have two fights then, right? And by the way, in the movie, in the Shadow movie, uh, you see where like the shadow will dodge when the purba comes for him, and it will like go through stone and then like circle around to come back for another attack. So we were doing that where it's going through these obelisks and stuff like that on this island. And it was circling around for more attacks. And so the street level guys were just busy trying to deal with that thing the whole time. Um, and then so Popeye jumps up kind of Hulk style, grabs a hold of one of Cthulhu's like beard tentacles or whatever you want to call it, and like pushes off of Cthulhu's chest. So he swings out, and then when he swings back again, he is like punching him and kicking him and stuff and doing damage. And every version of Cthulhu I found, they gave him hit points. And honestly, none of the write-ups gave him hit points that were at such a level that it seemed impossible to assume, Justice League or Avengers level characters couldn't kill him, you know. Uh so yeah, that's what happened is at the end of the day, Cthulhu becomes kind of a kaiju. Um Everybody beats on him, and the coup de grace or whatever, the final shot that does him in is from Mary Poppins. And I had given her um a just a boatload of spirit and the sorcery power. And so she just subbed sorcery for, I don't even know which power it was, spirit drain or something like that. And so yeah, she killed him. And like that was the adventure. And then um they leave on Popeye's boat and the island sinks back into the ocean. And that was that, you know. The other thing we established in the game was it was the one time there was an attractive female character around. And first of all, she was the only character we said was immune to Dagda's Valentino effect. So she had no desire to hit on him whatsoever. I thought that was very interesting. We'd never seen that before. And in my mind, it was because she had certain attributes of hers were infinite, right? So kind of like if you think of it as like a will save or something, and that's like, yes, she makes it. And then he wasn't hitting on her either, because of course, in the back of my head, I kept thinking about that. How many people were arguing that she was like God in disguise or something? And I'm like, yeah, I don't want to hit on God. Probably not a good thing. Um, but yeah, that was the famous Mary Poppins versus Cthulhu adventure. Um, People hated it. Nor Normally I would say at the end of one of these videos, "Oh, we had a good time playing it." Usually we do have a really good time role playing together. Not this time, man. Boy, did people hate this. This might have been the most hated thing I've ever done. I would have to think about it, but I mean, maybe. Um, but yeah, man, people really hated this one. And I don't know what, I don't know if it was, I was still using MySpace back then. Like I say, it's been a long time ago. But I posted this somewhere and like the hate mail just flooded in. And all the Lovecraft fanboys were just like, Cthulhu is the ultimate, and if you kill Cthulhu, oh yeah, Cthulhu. If you kill Cthulhu, the universe would blink out of existence and yada 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 yada. Um, I mean, I'll say this, I'm not the only one. You know, I've seen Cthulhu jokes on all sorts of cartoons and stuff, and so I'm not real worried about it on my end. Um, but yeah, I was surprised how much hate it got. I thought people were gonna hate it because they didn't like who Cthulhu was meeting, because it was like an awkward crossover, you know. Um, but now that wasn't it at all. They just were mad Cthulhu lost. So I was surprised. And I was thankful that at the end of the night, and we retired those characters. I don't, well, most of them. we'll see the Shadow and Indiana Jones again and some of those, but I don't think we ever again see Mary Poppins, and I don't think ever again do we see Popeye. Um, because they were the big two that I was like really not comfortable with them existing in my universe at all. Um, but I was glad that at least what they did in that particular game was comic book appropriate. That, for instance, what Mary Poppins did is nothing I couldn't imagine Thanos doing. Or what Popeye was doing was nothing I couldn't imagine the Hulk doing. So I thought on that level, at least it felt comic bookish. You know what I mean? At any rate, I think that's a good place to stop for this one. I hope that you thought it was interesting hearing about maybe not so much how the game itself went, but kind of the thought behind the game, how I put adventures together, stuff like that. As always, if you want to support the channel, make sure you hit like, make sure you're subscribed, ring the bell so you know when I upload stuff. And as always, leave us a comment. That really helps out with the YouTube algorithm. And I hope you guys have a great week, and I'll see you next time.